Hey everybody, we are back.
Hey,
How you doing, Mac? You good?
I'm good. You know, the sun is shining. Yeah. Sometimes weather makes such a difference. For,
It
for
does,
anyone
right?
listening in, when you're in London, London is like grey skies and raining all the time. But suddenly when the sun comes out, you just feel like a Californian.
I remember listening to Robbie Williams. Everyone knows who Robbie Williams, right? Is Take That singer. And someone was interviewing him and saying, "Why don't you live in the UK anymore?" And he was like, "Well, 6 months of the year, it's just dark and miserable. And I just didn't want that anymore." And I mean, lucky him. He's well off enough where he can spend, I don't even know where he lives, but he can spend the whole year in a nice sunny villa somewhere.
That's it.
But yeah, it does make a difference. So
It does. It does. That's very
today we
English of me to
wanted
talk.
to,
Very English of me to talk about the weather. How are you, Kenny?
yeah, yeah.
How are you?
And I'm good. I'm good. Am I good? Yeah, I was, it's been a late one this week. I've spent a lot of time for work, just staying up late, trying to close some loose ends on different projects. And then yesterday I was speaking at the HR Learning Technologies Conference, which
Mm.
for people listening is a trade show conference that happens, I guess, once a year or something like that in the Excel Centre in London. So that was good. I was given the graveyard shift at the end, which is always a
It's not the
fun one, right?
graveyard. It's not the graveyard shift. It's the headline act. Everyone
Headline
was warming
acts.
up. Everyone was warming up the
Yeah,
crowd.
everyone's warming up. We were going to talk today about Netflix culture, feedback. Mac, curious as ever, said he'd poke away, and
Find out more. Just for some context, me and Kenny recently worked together, and Kenny and a colleague of his often talked about that they use these phrases all the time. To be honest, it got a little bit annoying after a while, but they kept on using these phrases, which are Netflix phrases. And at first, I didn't quite understand them, but as I started to hear Kenny use some of these phrases or principles more and more, I became more and more curious about what they were, and I could see the power of them. And so, yeah, I was really genuinely curious to kind of dig into Kenny's mind a bit to try and understand a bit more about Netflix culture. And it's quite a famous culture. I know that it's one of those companies where its culture is positioned as a competitive advantage. And many companies try to follow in its wake and try to create culture memos and say that their culture or their values are competitive advantages. But Netflix feels like one of those kind of like first companies, I don't know, alongside your Amazons and your to start thinking
yeah,
about things in that way. So yeah, I wanted to kind of grill you a bit, Kenny, on the Netflix stuff.
yeah. And thanks, Mac, and let me start by saying my involvement. So I was based in London, looking after most of the EMEA, so Europe, Middle East, and Africa work. But I worked in what we call the talent team, artist formerly known as HR, right? But then I was also involved in the global team. So I worked a lot with the team based out in LA. I was there for about 3 years. In case people are wondering, like, what grounds do I have to talk about this stuff? And the culture work was work that I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about and talking everybody else through, whether that was onboarding, leadership seminars and things like that. So yeah, I thought, let me spend some time kind of laying out exactly how Netflix talked about the culture. One thing people don't realize is that if you go back to the beginning, Reed Hastings had a previous company, which I think was called Pure Software or something like that.
Really?
Yeah, he got a lot of
Okay.
lessons from that. It's like one of those classic founders, entrepreneurs who they have a number of different ventures and
Okay, yeah, this wasn't his first gig.
This was no, exactly. It wasn't his first gig. It wasn't his first rodeo. And so he did that, had some lessons learned from that. And the other thing to say as well is that part of my knowledge around this isn't just from my time at Netflix. So I spent time speaking to a lot of the folk in the US where the culture originated, right? Kind of doing mini interviews. It was my way of excavating and getting to the bottom of like what it means to work at Netflix. What most people don't realize before I get into detail is a lot of Netflix was an experiment. They didn't know for sure exactly what would work or how it would work. A lot of things we talk about now as we look back, and it sounds like kind of post the event, we've talked about how positive the culture has landed. But actually, it was an experiment. People went into it. And let me talk about some of the features of that experiment. What became known as the culture deck around 2009, I think it was that it came out. It was hundreds of pages. And when it came out, there were phrases like freedom and responsibility, context not control, informed captain, and I'll talk about what some of those things meant. And you're right, it took the whole industry, the tech industry, by storm, because Netflix was saying controversial things and things that other companies didn't feel as bold to say, and decisions other companies didn't feel as bold to take. Things like not tracking holidays and, not having budgets,
I think
right?
the holidays one, for some reason, I remember when you worked there, that was just like mind blowing.
Yeah, and then everyone followed suit and everyone started doing the same thing. I often get questions from people saying, does that really work? Do you find that people, because they have unlimited holidays, they don't take holidays or whatever? So we can get into that. But yeah, Netflix had this experimental approach. And if you zoom out, Reed's view was that, and he'd often talk about the Industrial Revolution and the kinds of organizations that were built for the 1950s and 1960s and a very command and control kind of model. And what he would say is, if you've got a company of creatives where creative thought and creative ideation is your currency, what is the kind of organizational climate that you need for that to grow? And ultimately, what his thesis was that you need a group of people who are really talented, hence talent density. You need a high concentration of high talented people, smart people, and you give them freedom. You ensure that they're able to lead with first principles thinking. So they're able to go into a space, and if they had a blank canvas, they've got enough smarts about them to figure out what they would do in that blank space, not derived from anecdote or based on what other companies would do.
Yeah.
And I'm doing a crude kind of quick summary of the thinking, right? So and the heart of Netflix is ultimately storytelling. And so it's people who are commissioners, who are creatives, who need the space to be able to think creatively and do all the stuff that creatives do. And as well as your engineers, right? So the idea was that you want a workforce of people who are operating at the edge of chaos, which is another line that Ray Dalio from Bridgewater Associates would often talk about. And that, I think, is that at the heart of how Netflix operates. It's like this pursuit for excellence, this pursuit for creativity. What's a tactic towards that goal? And one of the tactics is, well, give people freedom, give them an unusual amount of responsibility, give them feedback, give them complex challenges to solve, and then, you lead them to it. So like that was the initial, and then you have all of the other things that came out of that. But that's the kind of initial heart of it, I'd say.
There's a lot around freedom and giving people responsibility, essentially treating them like talented, creative adults that can do their jobs. So when I think of how many companies treat their employees, many companies treat their employees a little bit like children, so you're going to take advantage of something. If you give someone freedom, they'll take advantage, therefore, limit things, constrict things, check them, track them. There's an element of not treating employees like adults. And what you're describing is giving people freedom, giving them autonomy, giving them responsibility. What I'm curious about is one of the big things I've often heard you say is this thing of talent density. So this idea that you kind of hire the best in the market. To what extent do any of these principles only work because you have the best people? So if you had poor talent, would these principles apply, or are all of the cultural attributes that Netflix talks about dependent on the fact that they have high talent density and are getting the kind of top 0.5% of the market in terms of talent?
Yeah, it's good. Do you know what? And I should say from the outset is Netflix obviously wasn't perfect and isn't perfect, and we should talk about some of those aspects as well, because you mentioned talent density, and the reality is, let's be honest, not everybody fell into that talent density bucket. And we all like to think we did. I'd like to think I did, but not everyone did. And I'm sure there were moments where I wasn't. But you're right. I think you're right that Netflix had the resources and the money to remove people, take people from the market, and to steal people from competitors, like everybody was doing and is doing, right, in Silicon Valley and in the tech space. And so if you read No Rules, the book that Reed Hastings later wrote with Erin Meyer, one of the things he talks about in there, if I remember correctly, is to do all of the things that people hear Netflix doing today, like the informed captaincy, like farming for dissent, and again, we'll expand on some of those. You have to first have the right people in the organization.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Could you do it with people who weren't experts in their field or top of their game? Probably not in the same way. And I think that's the mistake companies make, is they look at what Netflix has done and they try to do a plug and play and a lift and shift, rather than thinking about, what is my context? Who are the people that I've got in front of me, and what makes sense for what this company needs at this point in time and with this particular.
What would you say? Can you talk a bit more about I still don't fully understand it, and I was curious about this one, but this kind of like, did you say informed captaincy?
Yeah. Let me walk through some of these. So
Yeah, walk through some.
yeah, and there's a Venn diagram we'd often talk about. One of my favorite leaders, I'll give him a shout out, Peter Riling. I learned so much from him. He used to work at the Aspen Institute, which is like a leadership institute, and he was a program lead there, and he ran a number of our leadership seminars or their leadership seminars. Anyway, he would often talk about this Venn diagram, and to say, like, if you think about culture as a Venn diagram, on one hand you've got aspirational culture and what we want this place to look like and feel like, and then on the other hand you've got the reality. And the fact is, very few environments are one-to-one mapping where the reality meets the aspiration. So the aspiration on this was that informed captain is, who is the person that's ultimately responsible for a decision? And what it was supposed to do was to create clarity, where if you're on a project, the person who's the informed captain is the person who is a key decision maker in driving and moving this forward. And the idea was that that person didn't need to be senior in title and position.
Yeah.
They could be a junior, a coordinator, and be the IC, also the informed captain, and they could drive something forward. But what they needed to do was they needed to farm for dissent. Again, all of these kind of catchy phrases. And farm for dissent was, go around, seek feedback, and get people to disagree with your ideas so that you can get the strongest, tightest kind of direction of travel for whatever it was you were working on.
Interesting. So does that mean an IC? So if there were a junior IC running a project, would someone, I don't know, 2 levels of hierarchy above them, would they have the opportunity to drive that project, or would the IC ultimately be accountable? So how do that work hierarchically? Because in many organizations, we've seen it before. Someone might be the IC, but often what happens is people sweep over the top, and effectively it becomes a hierarchical decision, or what just someone in a position of prominence wants to do versus what the actual informed expert thinks they should do. How did that work hierarchically with an IC?
Yeah, I shouldn't keep making this caveat, but people should assume every time we go into depth on this is that, like, there were many times where what I'm about to say was not true.
I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm more curious.
Yeah. People,
I'm not saying Netflix is like the epitome of perfect culture. I'm just more curious because even that aspirationally is, even to capture that aspirationally is a powerful concept, that an IC is the accountable owner, and I'm assuming would farm for dissent across their peers, more junior or more senior.
Yeah. How it was supposed to work is that you have someone who, again, think about the sports team mentality or frame, someone who is the informed captain. So they've got all of the context. And because it's a transparent organization, it is easy to get context. So you imagine through the environment, you're getting context from your team and your cross-functional partners on that project. You then had a informed leader. And this was a evolution of the culture over time, where what was happening was that people who were informed captains were essentially saying, hey, look, you're my manager, but you shouldn't infringe on my decisions here, or you shouldn't be infringing on what I think we should be doing, right? This is my space. Get your tank off my lawn. So, like, what happened after a while was, like, I remember distinctly Reed saying, look, there are decisions about which have a material impact on the company. And those kinds of decisions, your leader needs to be an informed leader and may weigh in and say, actually, I'm going to veto what you're trying to do here as an IC because I've got this context here, or I'm weighing it up and I think that we need to do X. So, like with everything, pushed to its extreme, it
It's
did become a
trade-offs.
little bit.
It's yeah, because cultural positions, like specific cultural positions, you can end up in a place where you make specific trade-offs, but then given the maturity of a company, whereas in this journey, those things have to adjust or recalibrate or realign. So it sounds like what the IC thing came first, and then the informed leader was introduced as a way to mitigate the impact of, an IC not going rogue, but
Yeah.
just acting too autonomously and making decisions that had bigger implications across the organization.
Yeah, exactly. So you had the thing of the informed captain, the informed leader, and again the cultural background of Netflix in the beginning, in the early days, was very much driven by Reed. Even the original culture memo, as far as I understand it, was pretty much Reed that wrote it.
Yeah,
I remember someone saying to me, Kenny, I feel like we're becoming, again at Netflix, I feel like we're becoming very corporate, and the latest culture memo, because the culture memo has gone through numerous iterations, right? The latest one feels sanitized. They said it sounds like it's written by someone
interesting. So as
from the
there were
HR
maybe
team.
caveats or things added, it was like, are we morphing something that had quite a strong differentiated position on culture, what that means at Netflix, into something that looks more akin to the kind of
Cookie cutter model of
cookie cutter
what
corporate cultures we often see.
exactly. Netflix would say things like, average performance gets generous severance package. That's the one that's often quoted. All decision points carry trade-offs, right? And part of the trade-offs that came with making that kind of controversial statement was that it meant there was a big level of chaos in the organization. So remember that quote I mentioned from Reed about operating on the edge of chaos?
Yes, yeah.
It's like, well, we give people a lot of freedom. Often what comes with that is the kind of messiness of decision making. And the theory was that most companies would create bureaucracy and process to manage all of that chaos.
Yeah.
And Netflix would say, well, we would rather have the chaos if that meant we could attract the right talent, and it meant the right talent had the freedom to make difficult decisions, the freedom to push creatively, for the in the best interest of the company. It's kind of like, why hire them in and then just have them bogged down in bureaucracy and process, was the hypothesis.
When you describe Netflix, so I heard this really useful sort of paradigm. I can't remember who kind of designed or thought about this, but it basically talks about explorative company cultures and exploitative on a spectrum. So your explorative companies, you basically want people to innovate. You want them to move fast. You want them to kind of be accountable,
Yeah.
act like owners, look for new market opportunities, design new products, services. You want them to kind of take action, partly because you're exploring a new space. So, you've landed on the moon and you're just trying to like plant a few flags and build a few, I don't know what you call them, moon bases.
Yeah.
But then what happens is over time, you get to a point where you kind of figure out what your business model is. You figure out kind of where clearly you're delivering value to which market, to which customers. And then a business starts to go into exploit mode. So it's like, okay, so how do we make this paper machine create more paper?
Extractive.
How do we tighten the nuts and the bolts? And then you start to see
Sweat
a
the
lot more
assets.
cultural traits that are to do with kind of control, efficiency, a company being more process oriented. But I always found that a really interesting sort of paradigm and way of thinking about different company cultures in terms of, are they needing to be explorative or exploitative based on their company maturity or based on where they are in their growth journey. There's an interesting question as to whether can a company grow and mature and yet retain its explorative edge. So I think there's so much at the moment around companies saying, I've heard Amazon talked about going back to day one culture. I know that internally they had a big drive around, we need to go back to how we were. We've become too corporate. We've got too many layers. We need to go back to the old days. We need to re-energize. We need to reinvigorate ourselves because we're losing who we are. And I always find that really interesting. I can see how corporate beasts and machines can start to remove some of that explorative edge, which means ultimately the company and business can start to suffer and it can start to struggle to compete. But is it also just a natural stage of maturity and growing up that you don't have the same energy and vigor in the same way that human beings, as they grow older, a 50-year-old man doesn't have the same energy as a 20-year-old man.
Yeah.
And I don't think ever really could or should because it's a different life stage. Anyway,
Yeah.
question. What's your thoughts on just
Yeah.
some of those musings?
There's a few layers in there, aren't there? Which one is you take a company like Disney, 100 years plus, you get to a size where the bureaucracy, the layers, you've become so inefficient in different places. It's hard to steer your company. There's this idea of steerability. A leader's ability to steer the organization erodes over time the larger the company becomes and the more the more layers there are. So I think there's that aspect. And then on the cultural side, as far as like exploitative versus kind of the explorative, if that's is it explorative?
Yeah, explorative. Yeah.
Yeah. It's I hadn't really thought about that. I do think the exploitative side, people would say, is Netflix's kind of insensibility when it comes to letting people go. So Netflix had this really interesting thing which enshrined in the leaders like Reed Hastings and others. There was this deep humanity, I felt. But on the other side, there was this deep ruthlessness. And
Interesting. So you're saying even though a lot of their culture would appear explorative, they were extremely exploitative about the way they viewed. So that I know the notion of like, is a sports team high performers in, if they're out, lose them. They were almost extremely exploitative in terms of their talent approach and thinking about who do we have in, who do we have out.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think that so much could be written about this from a anthropological and sociological perspective. They, I guess, try to get the balance between both of those things. I remember it felt like you would just get an email and in the early days, you'd get an email and it would say somebody has been let go and it would give you the reasons why that person had been let go. And it could be it could have been someone in India.
Oh,
yeah,
really?
yeah, to everyone.
Okay.
It would go out to the whole company. Now, a lot of this happened before I joined, but then I would often hear the stories. And they obviously later changed because you want to give people dignity, and often it's like it can actually harm that person's chance of getting another job afterwards if you're then sharing in that kind of way. So they then changed that. But then you'd be at the company, and I never forget. I give you the two examples. I was running some what we'd call peer problem solving sessions. And there was one lady who, she was great, but I went upstairs, the group we're in, the chair next to me was empty. And I thought, let's call her Sandra. I thought, where's Sandra? She's normally here. We waited a bit and then she didn't turn up, so we just moved on. The very same day I got a message on LinkedIn saying, sorry, Kenny, I wasn't there. I've been let go, and just kind of happened out the blue. And I was like, wow, okay, all right, well, I guess we'll just sort of move on. Another example, someone who I spoke to one day, everything was all great. He seemed fine. And then following day, he messaged me on LinkedIn, Kenny, just to let you know, I've been let go. And actually, I think it was me. Tell her I reached out to him because I hadn't seen him for a while.
Okay,
and then
so
he got back to me and said,
yeah,
I was checking in with him, and he said, yeah, I'd been let go. But here's the thing, Mac. He said to me, Kenny, the thing that hurt me the most was that the very people who I sat next to, who I worked with, none of them even checked in with me to ask what happened. And I didn't work that closely with him. Like, he was on the theatrical side.
And in that type of culture, if people just kind of go missing and that's part of the culture, there's just such a transience to it. On the London street I live on, like, actually most people, they're actually here for the next like 20, 30 years. I go 2 streets down, you never know who's like, they're more like almost like, in American terms, tenements. So it's like people move in, they rent, they might move out. So you don't get to know your neighbors because you just accept that they could be there for like 3 months and then they're gone. But it leads to this kind of transience. And even the feel of the street feels different. So on our street, people say hi, people connect. It even feels safer for my children. If I go to that street, it's just so transient. People are colder. And even though the street is the same length, people just don't connect on it. People dump stuff. So you get fly tipping on that street versus our street. There's a very different culture, very different experience.
Mate, that's honestly, you've hit the nail on the head in so many ways, especially given you hadn't been there or worked there, the fact that you've been able to acutely grasp that. Like, I remember I had this image in my head where being at Netflix felt like being on the beach. The tide would come in and the tide would go in and out and in and out. And you turn around, someone was there, tide would go in and out, you turn around, that same person wasn't there.
Wow, that's powerful.
And that was the image I had of being there. It's like, you just don't know who's going to be there. And you think, oh, John's gone. All right. We just move on. So that
But
transient
then
piece.
what does that mean for relationships? Like anything, you just don't get attached. So probably your relationships become a little bit more superficial because you just can't guarantee they're going to be there the next day.
I remember thinking, yeah, what is the point in investing in certain relationships in this kind of way when who knows who's going to be here tomorrow? So I do think there was speaking from my perspective, there was this interesting blend of you're in an entertainment organization where rooted in Hollywood, which is a very relational space, people were hired on the basis of high EQ. So there was a high EQ, high IQ sort of piece. When you joined, if you demonstrated curiosity, if you demonstrated emotional intelligence, that tended to get you places, I found. But then on the other hand, there was this like lack of sentimentality when it came to letting people go. People could be very cutthroat.
Yeah.
And I know that the higher you went up in the organization, the more you experienced the real kind of cutthroat nature of the business. So someone who was being cynical could say, well, Kenny, Netflix has just done a really good job of branding themselves with a certain kind of culture, whilst on the other hand, doing a completely different kind of thing. And I think that would be a harsh thing to say. I don't know if I'd go that extreme, because what I was told when I came in was certainly what I experienced. But I do think if you were more senior and in the upper echelons, you would have felt that dichotomy far more sharply,
Yes.
I think.
Yeah. I mean, what I find interesting about Netflix culture is they at least have a position. So I'm not saying it's a good position, but I find it interesting that there's been some thought given to here is like a differentiated way that we want to define who we are, define how we operate. The other thing that I find really interesting about what you've described is it's very kind of some of the different things you talk about, they're very tangible and practical. So when you talk about things like the keeper test, which I imagine you can explain in a minute to people that I don't understand what that is, or when you talk about informed captains, it's not like a value on a wall. So it's not like we're just going to have context, not control, and it's left there. It's kind of actually operationalized, and people are given sort of almost like behaviors or things that they're actually expected to do. So when you're actually working with people are going, I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, who's the IC on this?
Yeah.
It's quite operationally embedded. It's not just a concept on a wall. Is that true or not? As in how you're describing it sounds like they're things people use day to day.
Well, yes and no. And you like this because, funny enough, there were often emails where the feedback from a leader was to a project team was, you guys need to be, at the start of your meetings, you need to be asking, who is the IC on this? So it's interesting. So it's almost like human nature, and just like as social units and social structures, we revert to type. We revert to not wanting to be honest. So to your point, you then need these phrases and this language in the system that nudges people and pushes people in the right direction. Because if we know human kind of psychology, we know that people don't want to be honest. We know that people aren't going to want to step on each other's toes. So you need this forcing function to say, well, who is the informed captain to make that decision? So I would say, yes, it was something which was operationalized and tried to be operationalized. Our friend Andreessen Horowitz, he has this line where he says, culture isn't what you believe, it's what you do. And I think that Netflix tried to
do that.
Yeah, it was in different pockets.
Yeah.
But the problem was it was always, I think there was numerous challenges which we can go into. And if you take the keeper test, for example, the history was Reed was with his dad, as the story goes. I think they were fishing and Reed caught a fish.
As all good stories start.
Right? As all good stories begin, right, with fishing.
I wish I had a dad to go fishing with.
Right, exactly. Everybody listen to our last episode for more context on HMS Tikitoki. But so he was with his dad, so the story goes, they were fishing. He caught a fish. It was a big one. And his dad said, whoa, that's a keeper. That's a keeper. And so the idea was it was supposed to be an honest conversation about whether you had the right person in the right role for where the business was going. And in the early days, when everybody was next to each other, and they weren't so big, because remember, in about 2016, Netflix went global, but before it was just domestic. It was just in the US. And so, and they were small. And so you could have these honest conversations, and it was to ensure people could move fast and you didn't have the politics of the water cooler kind of side conversations. It later evolved to, there was a number of steps. It wasn't just, would you fight to keep me if I told you I was going? It was, how am I role modeling the culture and all of those sorts of things? What's the level of growth? But here's an interesting thing. The Netflix culture in the US had to be exported, or they tried to export it into Europe and into APAC. But it's different. You know what it's like with the labor laws
Very different.
in EMEA, right? Very different. So if you think about something like the Keeper test, yes, on one hand, it gives the manager clarity about, or it's supposed to give the manager some clarity about who's in their team, but it wasn't consistently applied. People were fearful of, if they were on visas, for example, do you want to be the one asking your manager whether you're passing their Keeper test, or do you want to be the one giving feedback openly and directly, knowing that that could have an impact on whether you're still going to have a place in the company, and that's going to impact your visa, which is going to impact your family. So there were just multiple layers to all of it.
And did it assume, or does it assume, that the manager has a good kind of is able to effectively judge whether someone is to be kept or not? So what if someone's got skewed judgment?
Yeah. Well, and that's how I think a lot of bias, and we said at the start that it wasn't definitely far from perfect, and that's where you did see a lot of bias and judgment that just crept in. And because Netflix paid, or there was one aspect to this, was Netflix paid a lot of money to people in terms of their base salary, their overall compensation. And so I think people turned a bit of a blind eye in some cases to what they felt like was a level of bias and a lack of kind of inclusivity in certain places. I will say, to be fair, the teams in the talent team and the inclusion team, I know they did a lot of work to kind of understand where some of that bias was and all of that.
I think something else that said that's really interesting about how you can define your values, your culture, but then it doesn't get embedded. It made me think a bit about this concept of kind of organizational atrophy. So like muscles.
Yeah.
Like organizations and teams, they just atrophy. So if you don't continually try to re-embed and at times reimagine culture, eventually, like you said, people kind of default to type. And then all of the kind of bad habits start to creep back in, or people just kind of default to their own personalities, their own way of doing things. So I think there's something really powerful about organizational atrophy, and how do you try and prevent that over time? Because we just start dropping the ball, even if we are trying to cultivate a particular type of culture.
It's almost like that sigmoid curve. Is it called a sigmoid curve, right? Where it's almost like an S curve. And at some point, how do you create a new curve on that as the tail falls down from a cultural perspective, from a business perspective? How do you then re-energize and create a new curve? And some of that comes from, let's be honest, from either new fresh blood, fresh talent, new hires, reorgs and changes in that way. Some of it comes from the willingness to evolve and iterate the culture and like rewrite it every so often as a way to kind of supercharge. Because you're right, it's
but I don't know if it happens. I don't know if so when we talk about like cultural, like creating culture, developing culture, I don't think we're systematic enough around, firstly, just being really clear in defining a differentiated culture. Here's the culture we want because we know that this type of culture creates these outcomes. I think most businesses, normally it's a senior leader who just has a couple of ideas, chucks on a piece of paper, a comms person or marketing, add a bit of sheen to it, and off we go. And so, you normally end up with 5 values or 5 behaviors, and they're not mutually exclusive. 2 of them are exactly the same. They're confusing. No one understands them. So there's something about like up front, really clearly defining, we want this type of culture based on what we're trying to do as a business, based on where we are right now. But then in the same way that you would evolve your business model or the way you go to market or the way that you operate, surely you should, in a really systematic way, say, okay, we're 2 years in now. how do we evolve this? How do we iterate this? Because some of the stuff isn't working. We can see there's atrophy across the organization. We can see that 2 of the 5 things that we described still stand. 3 of them make 0 sense. And so sometimes I see organizations and it's like they're still carrying the legacy of, the days when they all met in someone's garage,
Yeah.
5 of them, having a pizza. And it's like, but you're now a bit, a million people. And that wasn't a reference to Amazon.
Yeah.
They've got one called I think it's something to do with pizzas. Like you have to have teams should only be big enough that you can share a
I
pizza.
think I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
But so
Yeah, it's
sometimes you see
interesting.
things and then what you'll find is founders or leaders get like so excited about, oh, we did this back then. It's like, okay, brilliant,
Yeah.
but how does that apply now? I mean, it's like me saying, well, we did this back in 1995 when I grew up. It's like, okay, well done, Matano. Congratulations. It's 2026. Like
Yeah.
there may be
Yeah.
there may be enduring things from 95 that apply to 2026. But there may be some things that just make 0 sense right now. So I think it's just that maturity and that systematically developing and cultivating culture. But I don't know if there are always cultural arbitrators. I don't think there are people like who's accountable, who's the informed captain for
Arbiters,
culture in an organization. I don't really
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, I think,
It's-
I mean, the thing, again, we're using this word culture, which is a bit of a black
Yeah.
hole word, right? It means lots of different things, different people.
well, the way we do things, the way we
the way we do things. Yeah, exactly. But that emanates from the people. And so it's not an abstract thing that we can access and change conceptually, but the only way we change it is through changing the behavior on the ground or changing the
Yeah.
people. It's a bit like your personality, right? I mean, it's very difficult to change your personality unless you become a completely different person. You have a sort of a Damascus Road kind of experience. And I was thinking about Jim Collins, who wrote the book Good to Great. He also wrote this book called How the Mighty Fall. And in it, there are these 5 phases, and maybe it ties to what you're saying. And one of the phases is, well, the first phase is like what he calls hubris born of success. So the first way the kind of large companies begin to kind of decline is basically they get gassed, right? And because of their success.
Yeah.
And then he talks about undisciplined pursuit of more and kind of denial of risk and peril. So it's like, I wonder if that hubris born of success, that denial of risk and peril, those are the kinds of things that stop people from looking at the culture to see, okay, is this still working? Netflix used to say, we don't preserve the culture, we look to evolve it. But to your point, who is responsible for that? I suspect it should be the executive team, and they should be looking at that, but not looking at the memo, not looking at the language, but looking at the business as saying, where are we trying to go? What are the behaviors that are causing issues as to why we're not getting there? And have honest conversations about those behaviors, and then say, how is it we need to show up differently, and take all of that conversation and then go back in and write something down. But I did want to say, just call out some other things about the Netflix culture.
Yes.
Netflix would say they would hire fully formed adults. And I remember
So
thinking,
they'd actually use that phrase.
Yeah, they'd use that phrase. And I remember thinking,
Fully
well,
formed adults.
you're not exactly going to hire a baby now, are you? I mean, it's going to be, like an actual, here's your new hire, 6 months old. But that was the language. And the idea was that this was a place for people who are experts in their field. So I get it.
Okay, so that mature professionals.
That mature sort of, yeah. So, and that's why for a long time you didn't have graduate programs and things like that. In engineering, they did, but for most part they didn't.
Yeah.
But here's the kicker. The issue that created was around growth. So it got to a point where, yes, organizationally, Netflix felt like a mini MBA because the level of transparency, the context sharing and all of that. But then when it came to career and promotional growth, that wasn't there because you've already hired someone who's the sort of top of the game. There's nowhere for them to go. There's no headroom at all, right?
And even if you're hiring into a mid-level role, they're sort of the top of their game, and then
or because they were quite lean and there just weren't even roles for you to even move into, and so there became a a whole conversation around what does internal growth, what does employee growth even look like. But that was in tension with
But unless
what people
Netflix
were
is where you,
earning.
unless it's where you land. So there's a point in your career where progression and growth doesn't happen in the same way. There's a point in your career where there's nowhere else to progress to, but you've landed somewhere in a particular role. And then it might just be about diversity of experience, or maybe you want a different sector or a different challenge or a different
Yeah.
problem to solve. But
Yeah, I think joining Netflix, I would advise people who are, I mean, I'm no longer there and I'm happy where I am, but looking
yeah,
back, right, to make sure I put that
yeah,
in there for everyone listening. But for people looking to apply somewhere like Netflix, I think thinking about the timing of when you join in your career, because we would often talk about golden handcuffs, people who wanted to leave to pursue growth, but couldn't because they were being paid so well. And that for me was such an interesting thing to think about how, there were like Netflix and like similar fan companies, they would do this thing where they'd over retain people rather than paying bonus and equity. They would pay high base salary. And obviously, if you're mid in your career or younger in your career, you value that monthly income probably more
yeah,
than you
yeah,
do
yeah,
equity
yeah.
or sort of a bonus. And so all of those mechanics were at play, which was just interesting.
But then could you say that's also just quite honest? When you think about, you know, often short-term incentive plans and bonuses they're not guaranteed, but often they're virtually guaranteed in many organizations for senior people. Just building that into a base salary, being clear about it, paying people well. You talk about golden handcuffs. Arguably many the actual philosophy of joining a corporate is there's a part of it that is just that I mean, you could call a corporate. You could say that corporates leverage golden handcuffs. Like it's not Netflix just doing that. That's all kind of corporates and large
Absolutely.
organizations.
FANG and beyond.
Yeah, it's so
By the way,
there's
for people
something
who don't know,
maybe
FANG is Facebook, Apple, Nvidia, and all of the big giants.
there's a bit like when you're describing if someone's not good enough, they lay them off quickly. I want to say kind of like there's a bit of a brutal purity
Mm.
to what you're
knowing where
describing.
you
I'm not saying I
stand or
like
something,
it.
right?
I'm not saying I
Yeah,
like it,
yeah,
but it's like, oh, okay, so yeah, we all know that corporates pay well, and that's what keeps people in big corporates and stops them starting their own things. Netflix says, okay, fine, we'll just pay you top whack, and we'll just get the best people. We all know that, yeah, actually, when you're trying to lay people off and you're trying to do organizational change, it's costly, it's hard to do. Okay, fine, we'll just pay a ton of money to everyone. Like there's a brutal simplicity to it. Not saying I agree with it, but it's
yeah.
quite interesting just to hear how
You're
you describe it.
spot on, mate. Spot on again. Honestly, someone said it to me. Someone very senior said it to me. And when I was in the US, he said, "Kenny, I see Netflix as I'm on a kind of rodeo. I'm on one of those kind of wild horses, and it's a wild experience. It's a wild ride. But I know that at some point I'm going to get thrown off, and
Mm.
and that's it. And the phrase we would use is, we know that you're here for a good time, not for a long time, or you're here for a great
Okay.
time, not for a long time." And so that kind of pragmatism, that sort of, look, this is wild and complex problems, it's going to be fun, but there is no sense of loyalty from Netflix to the individual, which is, again, that sentimentality, that sort of we're not a family mindset. Although what's funny with the we're not a family is that later on, Reed and Patty McCord, who was the chief HR officer at one point, had said that they would have said that differently, because when they said we're not a family, people took that to mean that there was no real care. Again, the perspective externally was that Netflix is just brutal, but there was that tension. There was a lot of care internally. And in any great sports team,
Yeah.
you can't tell me that
Yeah.
people don't have love for each other in
Yes. Yeah.
the way a family might.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the distinction was families would be loyal to each other, whereas a sports team might not be as loyal to a fault. But here's another tension. In Germany, in places in Europe, Netflix offices were more like family businesses.
Yeah.
Like that's the kind of vibe. So if your company saying we're not a family, you export
but that's because you've got empowered employees, workers' councils and sort of employee law that means that people are just empowered. So you can't just let go of someone easily. So that just means that culturally, in Europe, you just find more stable organizations because you can't just, to your point earlier around like the tide coming in and coming out. Even in places other than Netflix, when I worked in global organizations in the US, the tide comes in and comes out faster. In the UK, it comes in and out
Mm.
a bit slower. In Germany, France, and places in Europe, the tide, I don't know, does nothing. In
But let's be.
organizations
Go
where
ahead.
we were making structural changes and literally had whole teams in like Germany never touched. As in
Bro.
like it's too much. So we'll just leave it there. We'll just let it lie because legally and the cost of it is too high. Therefore, that was interesting where kind of employee law just impacted the culture, and it didn't matter what type of culture was trying to be exported. Actually, the employee law sort of dictated how the company related to its employees and dictated how long employees might be around for, which I found really interesting.
Well, bro, I mean, look, this is the half has not been told, right? So let's be real about this. The fact is that in certain parts of Europe, right, if someone could be on sick leave for up to 2 years or something like that for a really long time. It's not the same in the UK, definitely not the same in the US. And so there were people who, truth be told, if they knew that they were going to get some negative feedback that they didn't like,
They got sick.
all of a sudden they were off. Yeah, they're gone. You wouldn't see them for years.
And employees understand that en masse, like as in they actually know, they know it. It's like a there's a particular country I'm thinking about that literally just what they do. They just go sick.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Which leads to a different type of dysfunction because then almost like the company is beholden to the employee. There's a flip. But I think it's relevant because it's Netflix culture. It's not a surprise that it emerged in the US. So
Yeah.
the ability to be brutally simplistic about some of these things, I think from a sort of employee relations law perspective, the kind of like Netflix culture could grow in that context. I don't think it could have grown somewhere else because as soon as they started to do certain things, essentially the law would have stepped in and kind of prevented it being expressed in that way. And I think for many of these companies, again, like if you start in the US and you start in that sort of landscape, as soon as you start to move globally, these companies start to confront different cultures, different employee expectations, which then there's, having to adapt to, having to shift to. So I imagine part of Netflix's journey would have been, we're domestic, we're brutally simplistic about some of these things, we're growing this company in soil where these ideas are kind of easily planted. And then suddenly now I'm over here in Europe. Oh, this is interesting. It's a very different employee relations and employee law landscape. Therefore, now I'm having to think differently about it.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. Netflix could only have originated in the US, which is a beautiful thing in many ways.
Yeah.
And the challenge that people had was, how do you export that across the world in the same way you've exported the streaming service and the whole entire enterprise? We can talk about it another time, but there's lots of things we haven't touched on, like the actual content and the Dave Chappelle show that just, caused a whole kind of variety of issues that forced Netflix to think hard about multiple things. So it wasn't just the internal conversations and operations, it was also the bigger part of it was the content side. I have been thinking about how organizations talk about who they are, a bit like we were saying earlier, the aspiration versus the reality, how you bridge that gap between the aspiration and the reality, and what does that look like, and is it even really possible to do that,
To close
to really close that gap? Because if you take feedback, and again, we'll make this a topic for the follow-up, but as a bit of a teaser, you remember that A Few Good Men, the Jack Nicholson Tom Cruise exchange, where he's in the dock and Tom Cruise is pushing, he's like, you want the truth, you can't handle the truth. I think there's a lot of that. Like, we say we want feedback, we say we want honesty, but deep down, a lot of people don't. If we're honest about it, And so you can be an organization that talks about candor, and this is not Netflix now. This is true for any business. An organization that talks about being honest, but then the reality on the ground is it's actually difficult for people to do that. And so the only way you bridge that is to have leaders who will constantly create a space where they're seeking it out.
But I would also say here, there's something about, don't try to shoot for a culture that is so aspirational and is so far from reality that it's just not possible. So, so if you're a company or a group of people, it's like your aspirational culture should launch off something about who you are. So maybe, like, let's take a small company. Maybe your company of, I don't know, let's say you're starting out and you're 30 people and you're defining your culture. You would define it based on something that was real. There's a sense of crystallizing. It's a bit like a family. I'm in a growing family. My wife the other day said, "Oh, should we create some family values?" I was like, I don't think she can hear me. I'm not sure. But
should I edit that out?
Yeah, she said that. Yeah, I think she works at Amazon, so maybe she's taken on the American thing of like family values. I don't know, like
yeah.
Hopefully
not.
You're
right.
Hopefully not implementing leadership principles, Amazon leadership principles in the home. But what I mean is, when you're growing, you start to realize, oh, there's things about how we operate and do things, and let's capture that. Now, when you capture that, it'll be based on the fact that, but you're codifying something real, and then you're adding in a level of aspiration. So if I were defining a family value right now, I might say, like, we love dancing and having fun. Like, we love dancing, having fun, and singing. So I don't know, a family value could be sing and dance every day. Maybe we sing a dance twice a week, but sing and dance every day is we want to do more of it. But now we want to create a moment for it continually through the week. But it's not crazy.
Here's a question. Let me jump in.
We're not a non-singing, non-dancing household.
Yes, with two people and some, younger critters along the side.
Critters. My children
critters. I said critters. Sorry, that's the wrong word. Gremlins.
I mean,
creatures. I meant to say I meant to say creatures.
Freudian slip. Fatherhood is hard at the moment. Critters.
With the two of you and two children, why would you want to write it down? Because I'm curious what writing it down serves.
Because we want to do more of it, because we can forget it. So sometimes you see these beautiful moments as a family where you're like, like I walked in today. At the moment, I don't know how my son got into this tune, but Tyler. The South African.
Oh yes,
she's a South African sort of Hammond piano. But there's a song called Chanel, and for some reason, my son sings the song Chanel. But I walked downstairs and I found him. I found my wife with my little baby, 4-month-old, dancing in the front room with my son. They're just dancing. Now that happens probably, I don't know, once a week. Maybe that happens. Sometimes we're not present as parents. Sometimes we're too busy. Sometimes we're consumed with getting him dressed and we forget to just enjoy the moments. So if I were to codify that as a family value, what it does is it just says, here's something important to us. We want to codify it because we want to make sure we do this regularly. Now, if I took that a step further, I might operationalize it. I mean, you can't operationalize dancing. But if I said,
Max using words like operation. We've been saying things like operationalize. People must be thinking, what the hell are they talking about?
I could say every day at 6:30 after dinner, I'm just going to create some space where I'm with my son and we're there together as a family. And we're just creating space where dancing is more likely to happen. And then maybe actually in, 5 years' time, we look back and having defined the fact that singing and dance was important to us and having made some space, we sung and danced a whole lot more, and a whole lot more joy was present in our house. That's I
do like the idea, and I agree with it. I'm just pushing here,
maybe you don't sing and dance with your children because you call them critters.
I'm going to edit that out. But I've got a friend who's got he's got a long list of family values, and he has it on the wall. I can't remember, but he's really, and he listens to this podcast. So if he's listening, shout out, he knows who he is. But here's the thing, here's why I'm pushing is that typically companies will want to get to the point where they codify it because they're getting to such a scale. They need everybody to essentially fall in line. A parallel to this is, if you take the Bible, for example, and we think, Jesus and his disciples, they hadn't codified what they were talking about. They hadn't codified their experience for a very long time. In fact, probably not until Paul wrote the first letters, right? Maybe some 20, 30 years
Okay,
later.
I'd
And so,
argue with that. I would
so
argue
okay,
with
so
that because they have.
but let me land on this point. So and again, I actually agree with your point. I think there's value in writing down, but just let's be playful a bit. So when there is something that is so automatic, it's part of who you are and part of what you do. I don't think you forget that. But then there comes a point at which other people now join the fold, and you want to make sure that they have clarity. And so I think when you take that sort of either tribal or kind of group approach, like you take the Jesus and disciples,
Yes,
or
yeah,
whatever kind of
yeah,
example you
yeah.
want to take, I find it interesting the stage at which you decide to write something down, because I think
Okay, so here's what I
Yeah,
would
go
say.
ahead.
I would say, firstly, in the context of like Jesus' disciples, they had very heavy oral tradition.
Yes.
So
So they didn't need to.
they would have orally remembered and held on to sayings, and they would
Yeah.
have shared those sayings. When the Bible was
Yeah.
written, it was just capturing those sayings in a book so
Mhm.
someone could read it.
Yeah.
Invention, printing press, mass, literacy, people can now read it. But oral tradition was heavy. So even if you think about defining a family value, it doesn't even mean we write it down now because we're the people of, reading and writing,
Yeah.
we're being that generation. But even if you ritualize it, so when I was talking about creating space where you can be present, it was about ritualizing something, creating kind of shared spaces and things that remind you of what's important to you. So again, you think of any big world religions, they have specific rituals, principles that when you join, you understand. And those rituals reiterate something about what this whole thing is about. And
Exactly.
those
Yeah.
rituals are a jump off and like a fast track to understanding the heart of it. Even if you just do the rituals, you quickly get a taste and you start to experience the thing.
See, I love that. I love that, and I'm totally down with that. And I used to work at a company called City Air. For some reason, every company I've worked at, culture has been a strong part of it. And they would have, if you don't know City Air, they've originated in Boston, I believe, and these are like young adults who would spend a year working with at-risk children, and they wear these red bomber jackets, and it would say City Air on the back. And they had a really strong culture, and they had all of these different rituals. When I first saw it, I thought, oh, this is a bit of a cult. This is really, really strange. But
Was it a cult?
thankfully not. Thankfully, it wasn't a cult. No, imagine if I said yes, gosh, God help me. But I love what you're saying because it becomes a forcing function. I just think it's interesting that there's something that happens when you create an abstraction of culture. You write it down, and I'm not talking from the family perspective now, but sort of generally, you begin writing it down, and the writing of it down becomes a thing of its own, a thing in itself. It takes on a life of its own to the point where people talk about the culture memo, and they talk about the culture as if it's a thing over there. It's a thing in that document.
Yeah, it creates.
And I just think there's a danger of it making an
distance.
abstraction. Yeah.
And then you get multiple abstracted levels. So the culture, the behavior would have been something real, observed, or it would have
Yes.
been, you go fishing with your dad and develop the keeper test. So there's something that's triggered it.
Yeah.
Whenever you write something or create something or ritualize something, there's always an argument to say how accurate or how close is that to what you've just experienced. And then as soon as then somebody else takes that thing and maybe interprets it differently. So for example, language and words, someone could interpret something very differently. Then then you get that process of it just starts to kind of change or morph with each person that interacts with it. And then you're not sure what you have. I mean, we've all had this example of being in companies where, I mean, it's crazy. There'll be like a phrase and you hear 5 people use the phrase differently.
Yeah.
Which is why for me, actually,
Yeah.
culture, it has to be simple. And it has to be translatable across a broad cross-section of people. The more obscurity there is in it, or the harder it is sometimes to actually conceptualize it, the more open it is to misinterpretation. And then you end up with situations where I've been in organizations where they're using phrases or ideas and literally reviewing someone's performance based on it. And
no one knows
if
what
I
it
put
means.
10 people in the room, they all think it means something totally different.
Exactly.
So now you're deciding people's compensation, people's career progression, just based on all of your own kind of interpretations of a couple of words.
Yeah, and this is a discussion we've been having internally in our team, where I work today, which is as soon as you start measuring how people are performing against values and things like that and behaviors, then it's like, well, judgment and bias just creep in, because if you say, if you take informed captain or whatever one of those words or phrases, how you see it culturally from literally your own national culture, like if you're from China or you're from Germany, your own approach is going to be different. But look, I feel like this needs a part 2 and part 3, because this is
let's talk about feedback. I think feedback's interesting, Kenny, because not
Matt,
now.
I've
not
actually
now.
got.
Sorry, not now. I'm not
Oh
talking
yeah,
about
not now. Okay. I was like, right, you're gonna go.
No. I'm saying
let's do it now.
Let's do it now. No. Let's talk about the feedback point, because I just think so much of how companies and organizations talk about culture, often feedback is a main dimension and theme that comes into the mix.
Yeah.
So I just feel like to go there could be interesting.
Let's do that
in our next chat.
Let's do it. Yeah. As ever, it's been great. Thanks for the
good stuff,
for the ride, and see you next time.
See you next time. See ya. Peace.